My family owns a remote cabin in the deep woods of northern Maine. It's completely off the grid. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove and the heavy silence of the pines. Last October, I decided to spend a weekend there alone to clear my head. The first night was quiet, but around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a strange sound. It was a rhythmic, dry, scratching noise coming from directly beneath my cot. It sounded like long, overgrown fingernails dragging slowly across the underside of the wooden floorboards. I froze, holding my breath, telling myself it was just a raccoon or a stray animal that had crawled into the crawl space underneath the cabin. I tapped my foot hard against the floor to scare it off. The scratching instantly stopped. Relief washed over me, and I finally drifted back to sleep.
The next morning, I decided to inspect the crawl space to find where the animal had gotten in so I could block it off. I walked outside to the side of the cabin where the small wooden hatch to the crawl space was located. My blood ran cold when I reached it. The heavy metal latch wasn't just open. It had been completely unscrewed from the wood, and the screws were neatly piled on a nearby rock.
I turned on my flashlight and slowly shined the beam into the dark, cramped space under the cabin. There were no animal tracks in the dirt. Instead, right beneath where my cot stood inside, the dirt was heavily disturbed, and the wood above was covered in deep, frantic gouges. Painted on the underside of the floorboards in black marker were the words, "Thank you for keeping so quiet." I packed my bags and drove home in a panic, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. "3 years ago, my college roommate and I rented a secluded cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains for a weekend hiking trip. It was a beautiful, modern place, but it had one creepy feature. The entire back wall facing the dense forest was made of massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows. There were no curtains or blinds. On our second night, we were watching a movie in the living room when I felt that primal, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. I looked out into the pitch-black woods. At first, I saw nothing but the reflection of our own living room. But then, about 50 yards out among the trees, I noticed a tiny, unblinking red light. It wasn't moving. We assumed it was just a trail camera set up by the owners and tried to ignore it, eventually heading to bed. At roughly 3:30 a.m., I woke up thirsty and walked down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked past the massive glass wall, I glanced out into the yard. The red light was still there, but it wasn't 50 yards away anymore. It was barely 10 feet from the glass. In the dim moonlight, my eyes adjusted, and my heart dropped into my stomach. The red light wasn't a trail camera. It was the recording indicator of a high-end video camera, held by a tall, motionless figure dressed entirely in black. He was standing right on the deck, pointing the camera directly at the glass, filming me. I screamed for my roommate, and the figure instantly turned and melted back into the dark woods. When the police arrived, they found footprints all over the deck, and a small, hand-drawn map of the cabin's interior layout dropped near the tree line. I was working as a freelance writer and rented a cheap, rustic cabin in Oregon for a month-long writing retreat. It was incredibly isolated, located at the very end of a gravel fire road. Because I felt completely alone out there, I got into the habit of leaving the front door unlocked during the day while I paced around brainstorming. However, on my fourth night, a severe thunderstorm rolled in. The wind was howling, shaking the cabin's old frame. The atmosphere was incredibly unsettling, so for the first time, I made sure to lock the heavy wooden front door before going to sleep. I checked the deadbolt twice, heard the satisfying click, and went to bed feeling secure. In the middle of the night, a loud crash of thunder woke me up. But right after the thunder faded, I heard a sound that made my chest tighten. It was the distinct, heavy creak of the cabin's front door swinging open, followed by the wet, squelching sound of muddy footsteps stepping onto the hardwood floor of the living room. I lay paralyzed in the dark, my door cracked open just enough to see a sliver of the hallway. Through the gap, I watched the beam of a flashlight sweep across the walls. A low, raspy voice whispered, "But you always leave it open." I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying they wouldn't check the bedroom. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated and the front door clicked shut. When I finally gathered the courage to investigate at dawn, I found the front door unlocked. Lying on the kitchen table was my spare key, which I had kept hidden under a fake rock on the porch. I realized then that they hadn't broken in. They had been watching me from the woods for days, waiting for the one night I finally locked them out. My wife and I rented an old, hand-hewn log cabin in northern Wisconsin for a long weekend in the dead of winter. It was a rustic place, with the main source of heat being a massive, floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace in the center of the living room. The first night, the temperature plummeted well below zero, and the wind was absolutely vicious, whistling through the trees and rattling the window panes. Around midnight, as we were trying to fall asleep in the loft bedroom, we started hearing a strange, muffled scraping sound. It sounded like it was coming from inside the stone chimney stack. We assumed it was just a bird or a squirrel that had gotten trapped inside, though it seemed too heavy and slow for a small animal. Eventually, the noise faded and we fell asleep. The next morning, the cabin was freezing, so I decided to build a fire. When I opened the heavy cast iron damper inside the fireplace, a massive shower of soot and ash fell onto the hearth. But along with the soot, something else tumbled out. A small, dirty silver key. Confused, I picked it up and realized it matched the lock on the padlocked cellar door outside, which the owner had explicitly told us was off limits. Out of sheer curiosity, I put on my winter coat, walked out into the freezing wind, and unlocked the cellar door. I pulled it open, shined my phone's flashlight down into the damp concrete room, and gasped. Directly beneath the chimney stack, the brickwork had been completely hollowed out to create a crawl space. Sitting on a sleeping bag inside that space was a pair of binoculars, a stack of Polaroid photos of my wife and me sleeping taken from the loft railing, and a notebook. I opened the notebook to the first page. Written in frantic, messy handwriting was a single entry from the night before. They lit the fire. I had to climb up. I was house-sitting a remote luxury cabin in the Cascade Mountains for my uncle while he was out of the country. It was a beautiful place, but because it was so massive and isolated, it felt incredibly eerie at night. To help me feel a bit more secure while I slept in the master bedroom downstairs, my uncle had suggested I use the plug-in baby monitor he kept in the upstairs guest suite. He said if anyone so much as stepped onto the wraparound porch near the guest suite entrance, the high-sensitivity microphone would pick it up instantly. The first 2 nights were completely peaceful, with only the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the wind in the trees coming through the receiver on my nightstand. On the 3rd night, I was jolted awake at 3:15 a.m. by a sudden blast of loud, crackling static from the monitor. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. As the static cleared, I didn't hear wind, and I didn't hear footsteps on the porch. Instead, I heard the distinct, heavy sound of slow, congested breathing coming from the upstairs guest bedroom. I froze, gripping the bedsheets, telling myself it was just some bizarre radio interference. But then, a voice drifted through the speaker. It was a raspy, distorted whisper, speaking directly into the monitor's microphone upstairs. "Are you awake yet?" Terrified, I grabbed my phone and a heavy flashlight, quietly slipping out of the bedroom. I stood at the bottom of the wooden staircase, looking up into the pitch-black hallway of the 2nd floor. The breathing on the monitor in my hand was perfectly synchronized with a faint, rhythmic rasping sound coming from the top of the stairwell. Suddenly, the breathing stopped. Through the monitor, I heard the sound of the upstairs microphone being picked up, followed by the slow, creaking sound of footsteps walking toward the top of the stairwell. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted out the front door, ran to my car, and drove to the nearest town to call the police. When they searched the cabin, the upstairs room was empty, but the baby monitor receiver was gone from my nightstand. It was found sitting on the top step of the stairs, still turned on, with a handwritten note taped to it that read, "I like your flashlight.